One of my favorite movies growing up was Rocky IV because, and also, but especially because, but I do remember being somewhat confounded by attempts of the writers to get psychological or worse, philosophical with the story. As a kid, I remember being confused about why adults thought this was an important question. It was this whole deliberation about whether or not people can change. Apparently, some people claim,
but you can't change what you really are. You and me, we don't even have a choice.
While others claim,
everybody can change.
And obviously, as a kid, I didn't have the horsepower or even really the interest to resolve the question, but I also remember thinking, why is this even a question? It's strange that people are even wondering about this. And then more recently, one of my daughters was sick in bed all day, so she asked if she could listen to some music. And a song from a Disney movie stood out to me where there was this line that says, "I'm not saying you can change him because people don't really change." And I thought that was strange. Why go through the effort of putting something so irrelevant to the minds of children in a kid's song unless you thought that this was an important truism for kids to adopt before they're able to start thinking critically about it? Well, now that I'm a grown-up, I have some experience of what it means to live a human life, and I've had the opportunity to even read some books on topics like this. As a result, can I please just say, that is ridiculous. I get that it can be hard to rationalize and make sense of, but I don't know what could be more undeniable than the unambiguous truth that people change, and change a lot over the course of their lives. So Aristotle taught that time is merely a measurement of change, which isn't a common way of thinking about it, but if you do think about it, I think he's absolutely right. And if you don't think so, imagine a scenario in which everything around you, everything you could see and touch and smell, suddenly came to a freezing halt. Like all the activity and the movement, the buzzing of life and the motion of the cosmos, it all just suddenly stopped, except for you. What would you conclude about that? You would think, well, time was standing still for some reason, because nothing is changing. To be in time is to experience change. You and I, because we can't escape time, will inevitably experience change every moment of our lives. The question is it going to be a kind of change that we're going to be happy with? Or is it a kind of change that we won't be very happy with? And this whole question of change as posed by the philosophically illuminating Rocky Balboa was ironically a huge stumbling block to the whole enterprise of reason because of the riddle that it posed. And that riddle is, how can a thing change and still be what it is? Which sounds kind of stupid until you really actually think about it. Take yourself, for example. You start out in life as a 7-ish pound, hairless quadruped that is physically pathetic, but luckily still very adorable. So then 30-some years later, you look nothing like you did before. Every cell of your body has died and been regenerated. You have all kinds of skills and abilities that you didn't have before. Yet, you're still you, right? How do we make sense of that? Instinctively, we just know that that's the case. We know you're still you, but how do we account for that rationally? And some ancient philosophers said, we can't. And therefore, this whole thing we call reality is actually unreasonable. So there's no point in trying to apply your reason to understand it. It's futile, you'll get nowhere. They were known as the sophists, and if it wasn't for Socrates beating them at their own rhetorical game, we would have accepted their proposal and never bothered trying to be reasonable. We never would have invested in universities, philosophy, and certainly not science, as ambitious an undertaking as that is, but we did because Plato and then Aristotle came up with compelling answers to those riddles. Aristotle and Plato had a very holistic approach to science and to reason. To Aristotle, for example, if you were going to inquire about something, try to define and understand what it is, you had to look at the whole range of what it is as we are able to perceive it. First, you wanted to know what is it made of? What is its material composition? Is it made of organic matter? Is it made of inorganic matter? Is it made of dirt or gases or rocks or metals? And then from there, he wanted to know that material, that matter that it's made of, how is it organized into a specific form so that even though something like a dog and a monkey might be made of very similar matter as far as we can tell, the form that they take makes them substantially different. Then he wanted to know what caused it to be, what preceded it, where did it come from? And then lastly, where is it going? What is its purpose or its end? And if you can come up with explanations for those 4 questions, you would approach something like a complete definition of what something is. And this applies to us as well. If you can answer those questions, you can get an idea of what a human being is and what it is that we're supposed to be doing, how it is that we're supposed to be living our lives to fulfill what it is that we are. But during the so-called Enlightenment, far from being an expansion of reason, it was actually a contraction of reason. Philosophers like Bacon said we can't know anything about purpose and form by our reason, so in the interest of science, let's just stick with matter, what it's made of, and its efficient cause, what caused it to be. And this is why today, when it comes to moral questions about how it is that we're supposed to live our lives, science has nothing rational to say about it. And further, it also is why science can't answer the ancient riddle about change. Instead of trying to answer it, science, or whatever we mean by that, is just conspicuously silent about it, which is why virtually everyone I talk to about it with a modern scientific education is a little dumbfounded by the fact that this question has evaded them up until that point. So given that we do change a lot over the course of our lives, and that modern science is incapable of telling us how we ought to live through that change, it stands to reason that we should look to thinkers like Aristotle, who developed an entire system of ethics not based on how we feel at a given moment or over a period of time, because that's often incoherent, and not based on the fashions of the day, which are also incoherent, but based on logic and reason. Now, I'm not going to try to give a comprehensive lesson in Aristotle's ethics because I'm not qualified for that, and this video isn't 10 hours long, but I do want to highlight a couple considerations for you as you look into this more yourself. The first is that, as I've already said, to be in time is to change. And so the question I alluded to at the beginning is, do we want to allow that change to happen accidentally on its own? Or do we want to deliberately engage in that process of change and shape the kind of change that takes place in our lives? And I'll answer that question by saying that vice is what happens by accident. Nobody sets a goal in their lives to become an abuser or to become greedy or an addict. They become these things because they didn't know how to avoid them. Virtue, on the other hand, happens on purpose and often with significant sacrifice. For example, fitness happens on purpose, whereas disease, obesity, and a diminished vitality, that happens by accident. Good mental and spiritual health happens on purpose. Bad mental and spiritual health happens by accident. If you ask someone who is overweight and out of shape how that happened, they will probably express bewilderment or say, I don't know, it was inevitable, it's just my genetics. But ask a person who is really fit and active how they got that way, and they'll likely be ready with answers. People who are suffering from mental illness are often helpless to understand how or why it's happened to them. But people with consistently good mental or otherwise any form of health are probably ready to explain what they do to build that disposition. The second thing to realize is that change, whether deliberate or accidental, most often occurs in small incremental steps. Nobody becomes addicted to alcohol, for example, after their first sip of wine. Nobody becomes a skilled musician after their first music lesson. Nobody achieves all their fitness goals after one trip to the gym. But when we come to the realization that some kind of good change is needed in our lives, we don't seem to appreciate that subtlety, the smallness of how that occurs. Instead, we tend to think of our goals as the result of profound and ambitious, singular, huge choices. The fact is, they tend to be the accumulation of thousands of seemingly insignificant small choices that, when multiplied over time, result in significant outcomes. For example, you may want to get good grades, so you could just make grand resolutions followed by theatrical acts of the will like all-night cram sessions. Or you could decide to consistently go to bed at a reasonable time, eat well, and then set out a reasonable study plan for every day of your curriculum. And getting fit, that's not about making monumental, grand, ambitious resolutions. It's about waking up half an hour early today and working out, and then doing it again tomorrow and then the next day, and being consistent about it with small decisions which eventually accumulate into something like fitness. We get so distracted between the distance of where we are and the goals that we might want to achieve that we assume that the decision we have to make is as significant as that gap. The truth is, there's no big, someday grand decision that will bridge that gap for us. There's only the small, wise, unsexy, seemingly insignificant decisions that you can make right now, then when multiplied thousands of times will get you to your goal. That's how virtue works. It's about building good habits which stabilize into dispositions which are like second nature. It's also how vice happens, though, by the way. To become an alcoholic, you have to turn to alcohol a lot before one day you turn around and turning to the bottle as a remedy to your problems or your habits is just second nature, often met with great surprise and shock, like, how did this happen? In closing, I'll leave you with a quick introduction to the kinds of virtues that you should be aiming for in your life. These were recognized by the earliest ancient philosophers and thinkers and were adopted by the medieval thinkers and are still encouraged by mostly the Christian churches today. And now these are the people who actually thought about these questions instead of just letting their emotions decide for them. They are justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. They are known as the cardinal virtues because all other natural virtues proceed from them. If you can develop these, the others that we are all sort of familiar with will fall into place. So spend some time learning about them and then make a plan to foster them in your life. Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we internet in Canada. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.